This 1913 portrait appears cheerful, but look closely at what's in her lap. Dr. Michael Torres adjusted his archival gloves and carefully lifted the photograph from its sleeve. The Charleston Historical Preservation Society had acquired it 3 weeks ago from an estate sale, and Michael was cataloging early 20th century photographs of African American life in the Low Country. This image was remarkable, a formal studio portrait from Reynolds' studio. March 1913. The woman sat in an ornate chair against classical columns, dressed elegantly in a dark dress with a lace collar. She appeared to be in her early 30s, her hair styled in the fashionable pompadour of the period. But what struck Michael most was her expression. She wasn't showing the hesitant uncertainty common in photographs of black subjects from this era. She was smiling broad, confident, almost defiant. Her hands rested in her lap, holding something folded carefully. A document of some kind. Though details were obscured by the photograph's age, Michael scanned the image at high resolution, a routine process he'd performed hundreds of times. As the scan completed, he zoomed in on her face first, examining the professional lighting and composition. Then he moved to her hands and the mysterious object. He enhanced the contrast and adjusted sharpness. Words became visible on the folded paper. Deed of property and state of South Carolina, with what appeared to be an official seal. Michael sat back, his heart racing, a property deed in the hands of a black woman in South Carolina in 1913. He understood the significance immediately. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, black property ownership in the South became increasingly rare and dangerous. By 1913, most black families were sharecroppers or domestic workers, systematically barred from land ownership. Yet here was this woman, dressed in her finest clothes, sitting for an expensive formal portrait, proudly displaying a property deed. Michael grabbed his phone and called his colleague, Dr. Aisha Williams, a historian specializing in African American property rights. Aisha, I need you here now. I found a photograph 1913. Black woman holding a property deed in Charleston. And she's smiling like she knows exactly what it means. Silence then. 10 minutes. Michael looked at the photograph again, at the woman's confident smile, at the document held like a shield or declaration. Who were you? He whispered. And what happened to you? Aisha arrived breathless. She was a tall woman in her 40s, with silver-streaked locks, and she had collaborated with Michael on several projects documenting black land ownership and displacement. Show me, she said. Michael displayed the enhanced image on his monitor. Aisha leaned close, studying every detail. Reynolds' studio, March 1913, she murmured. He was one of the few white photographers accepting black clients for formal portraits. Expensive. She paused. This wasn't casual. Look at what she's holding. Michael zoomed in on the document. More text became visible through enhancement. 125 acres. Clover Township. Granted to Clover Township, Aisha said immediately, pulling out her tablet. About 40 miles north. Rural. Agricultural. She searched historical records, then stopped abruptly. Oh no. What? Clover Township. 1914. There was a massacre. She showed him a scanned newspaper. Negro settlement abandoned after dispute. That's the white version, Aisha said bitterly. Black newspapers called it what it was, planned expulsion. A prosperous black farming community called Freeman's Rest. 30 families owned over 2,000 acres, school, church, store, complete independence. In September 1914, Aisha continued, white landowners accused the community of threatening prosperity. They gave families 48 hours to leave. When some refused, night riders burned homes. 3 people killed. The rest fled. Within a week, Freeman's Rest was empty. Michael stared at the photograph. This woman was probably from that community. She took this portrait in March 1913, holding her deed. 18 months later, everything was stolen. They worked silently, enhancing different sections. Finally, near the bottom, a name appeared. Abeth Freeman. Elizabeth Freeman, Aisha breathed. Freeman's Rest was probably named after her family. We need to find out what happened to her, Michael said. Aisha was already typing. Elizabeth Freeman, Clover Township, 1,913. Let me search property records. Census data. Michael looked at the photograph once more. Elizabeth Freeman sitting proudly, holding proof of everything she'd built, just before it would be violently taken away. "We're going to tell your story," he promised. "All of it." The South Carolina State Archives was 2 hours north in Columbia. Michael and Aisha arrived the next morning with everything they'd learned about Elizabeth Freeman and Freeman's Rest. The archivist, Robert, led them to land records. Freeman's Rest. "I've heard of it. Not much documentation, though. Most black community records were destroyed or never kept." Michael opened the massive deed book for 1,910, 1,915. He scanned pages of property transactions, mostly between white landowners. Occasionally, he found black property owners, always marked colored or Negro beside their names. Then, March 2nd, 1,913. Deed recorded this day. 125 acres in Clover Township. Granted to Elizabeth Freeman, colored. Fee simple ownership in consideration of $875 paid in full. "She bought it outright," Michael said, hands trembling as he photographed the page. March 2nd, 1,913. The photograph was taken the same month. She got her deed and immediately documented it. "This was a statement," Aisha said. She wanted proof. Legal documentation. They found more entries. The Freeman family owned multiple parcels over 400 acres combined. But the entries stopped after August 1914. In October 1914, new deeds appeared, the same parcels sold to white buyers at drastically reduced prices. "Elizabeth's 125 acres, Michael said, pointing. "Sold October 1,914 to James Whitmore for $200 less than a quarter of what she paid. She didn't sell it," Aisha said. "It was stolen. They forced her out and took the land." Robert brought newspaper archives from 1,914. The articles were filled with racist justifications, blaming the black community for agitation. But buried in one article, Michael found, the restoration of order was overseen by landowner James Whitmore, who stated removal of the troublesome element was necessary. "James Whitmore, the same name on Elizabeth's stolen land deed," Michael said slowly. "He led the expulsion," Aisha replied. "Then he bought her land." "Stole her land," Aisha corrected. This was organized theft, backed by violence. They searched later census records. Etienne Jobai Archer, Elizabeth Freeman, age 42, Charleston. Occupation: domestic worker. Living in a boarding house. From landowner to domestic worker, Michael said quietly. From 125 acres to a rented room. She never recovered. He whispered. "She survived," Aisha said firmly. "She got out alive. Found work. Kept going. See, they found her death certificate. Elizabeth Freeman. Died February 1951, age 73, Charleston. Buried at Emmanuel Church Cemetery. Almost 40 years after losing everything," Michael murmured. The question remained. Did she have family? Anyone who inherited her story? Church records from Emmanuel AME showed Elizabeth joining in October 1914, right after the expulsion. The record listed family. Daughter: Ruth Freeman, born 1905. Son: Daniel Freeman, born 1908. She had children, Michael said. They were 9 and 6 when Freeman's Rest was destroyed. They traced Ruth and Daniel through census records. Ruth appeared in Philadelphia in 1930, working as a seamstress. Daniel appeared in New York in 1940, working as a porter. Both had left South Carolina during the Great Migration. After hours of searching birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries, they traced the family line forward. Ruth married in Philadelphia in 1932 and had 3 children. Daniel married in New York in 1935 and had 2 children. Elizabeth has living descendants, Aisha said emotionally. People who should know her story. Ruth's granddaughter was Dr. Teresa Morrison, a sociology professor at Temple University. Michael found her faculty page and sent an email explaining the photograph. Teresa's response came within 2 hours. I know about Freeman's Rest. My grandmother Ruth told me stories before she died. She remembered fire, her mother crying, people running. She remembered her mother saying, "They took our land." I've been trying to piece together what happened for years. A photograph of Elizabeth holding her deed, that's extraordinary. When can we talk? They scheduled a video call. When Teresa appeared on screen, Michael immediately saw the resemblance Elizabeth's strong features. The same direct gaze. "Show me," Teresa said. Michael displayed the portrait. Teresa's hand rose to her mouth. "That's her. That's Elizabeth. My grandmother had one old photo of her. But this, she looked so proud." Michael walked Teresa through everything. The deed records, the expulsion, the evidence that James Whitmore had orchestrated violence and then purchased Elizabeth's land. Teresa listened intently. "My grandmother died in 1978, she said. Before she passed, she made me promise. Find out what happened to our land. Find out who took it. Make sure the world knows. I became a sociologist, partly because of that promise. Your great-great-grandmother created her own evidence," Aisha said. "This photograph, she documented her ownership." "What happened to her deed?" Michael asked. "Buried with her," Teresa said, her voice breaking. "Elizabeth kept it her whole life, hidden in her Bible. She showed it to Ruth and Daniel when they were adults and said, 'This proves we owned land. They can take the land, but they can't erase that truth.' Ruth told me Elizabeth wanted it buried with her, because the living world hadn't honored it. But now we can," Aisha said firmly. "We have the photograph, the historical records, proof of theft. We can tell Elizabeth's story." "I'm in," Teresa said immediately. "Tell me what you need." Over the next 3 months, the project expanded dramatically. Teresa brought in legal historians, property rights experts, and genealogists. Together, they built a comprehensive case documenting Freeman's Rest. They identified all 32 black families who owned land in Clover Township in 1914. Through records and oral histories from descendants, they traced what happened after the expulsion. Most fled to Charleston or Columbia. Some went north during the Great Migration. A few tried staying nearby and were found dead within months, officially ruled accidents, though the timing was far too suspicious. Not one family received compensation. Not one perpetrator was prosecuted. Research revealed James Whitmore's full role. He hadn't acted alone. 6 white landowners formed the Clover Township Restoration Committee, organizing racial violence and theft disguised as civic concern. Their method was systematic. Spread rumors of a black uprising, pressure law enforcement to ignore threats from night riders, then give families an ultimatum: leave or face violence. When families refused to abandon property, the committee ordered attacks. 3 people were killed. Joshua Carter defending his home, elderly Sarah Pleasant too sick to flee, and teenage Thomas Freeman, Elizabeth's nephew, shot while trying to save the church. Michael found Thomas's death certificate. Cause: gunshot wound. No investigation. No arrests. Elizabeth lost her nephew, Michael told Aisha quietly. 16 years old. Murdered. Never prosecuted. They compiled everything into a 247-page report. Teresa organized a gathering of Freeman's Rest descendants in Philadelphia. Nearly 50 people came, many meeting for the first time, unaware they shared this history. Michael projected Elizabeth's photograph onto a large screen. The room fell silent. An elderly man began crying. "That's proof we owned land. My grandfather always said his family had land, but he didn't have papers." Nobody believed him. Story after story emerged. Fragments of family memory finally validated. Teresa addressed the group. "We're seeking formal historical recognition. We'll document every family, every stolen acre. We'll petition South Carolina to acknowledge that Freeman's Rest existed, was destroyed through racial violence, and that what happened was theft." "Then what?" someone asked. "Reparations," Teresa said. "Once we have acknowledgement, we pursue legal remedies. The land was stolen. We have proof. We have standing." Michael added, We're creating a memorial at Freeman's Rest. Right now, there's nothing. We want a historical marker with all 32 family names. By the end of the meeting, they had formed the Freeman's Rest Historical Justice Coalition with Teresa as president. The mission was clear: recognition, reparations, preservation, honor. An elderly woman approached Michael afterward. "I'm Ruth's cousin. I met Elizabeth once, in 1925. I asked why. She looked sad. She said, 'Child, when they take everything you built, a piece of your heart stays buried in that stolen ground.'" The woman looked up at the photograph. "But I see something else here. A woman who knew her worth, who documented her achievement, who made sure the truth would survive. Thank you for seeing her. Thank you for believing her." The petition to the South Carolina Historical Commission was submitted in November. 247 pages detailing Freeman's Rest, the 1,914 expulsion, affected families, and evidence of organized violence and theft. Elizabeth's photograph was the centerpiece visual proof that Black land ownership had existed, was legitimate, and was deliberately erased. The commission scheduled a January public hearing. Michael, Aisha, and Teresa prepared extensively, knowing they would face resistance. Acknowledging Freeman's Rest meant confronting a brutal history suppressed for over a century. The hearing room was packed. Descendants filled one side. Representatives of current Clover Township landowners, many descended from the 1,914 perpetrators, filled the other. Commission Chairman Richard Hayes called the hearing to order. "We are considering a petition for historical recognition of an alleged 1,914 incident in Clover Township. Petitioners may present." Teresa introduced herself and outlined the coalition's goals. Michael presented the historical evidence. Deed records proving 32 Black families owned over 2,000 acres. Newspaper articles describing the disturbance, death certificates for the 3 killed, and deed transfers showing land sold to whites for fractions of its value. Finally, he projected Elizabeth's photograph. "This woman is Elizabeth Freeman," Michael said. "March 1913, Reynolds Studio, Charleston. She's holding the deed to 125 acres she owned. 18 months later, she was forced from her land under threat of violence. Her nephew was murdered. Her community destroyed. The land she's holding proof of was stolen and sold to James Whitmore for $200 less than a quarter of what she paid." Silence filled the room. This photograph is evidence. Evidence of legitimate Black ownership. Evidence of pride and achievement. Evidence of what was built and what was stolen. We are asking for formal acknowledgement that Freeman's Rest existed, was prosperous, and was destroyed through organized racial violence for the purpose of seizing property. Descendants testified next, sharing family stories, letters, and the intergenerational trauma of violent dispossession. The opposition's attorney argued there was incomplete evidence, claiming the 1,914 departure was voluntary relocation, and the deed transfers were legitimate. He never addressed the photograph, never explained how voluntary relocation involved 3 deaths, and never acknowledged documented violence. Aisha took the rebuttal. Opposing counsel claims legitimate transactions. Elizabeth paid $875 for her land in 1913, over $26,000 today. 18 months later, it was transferred to Whitmore for $200. That's not a transaction. That's theft under threat of violence. She clicked to the death certificates. Counsel claims voluntary. Here are Joshua Carter, Sarah Pleasant, Thomas Freeman. All killed the same week. 32 families abandoned their homes. That's not voluntary. That's organized expulsion backed by murder. After 6 hours, Chairman Hayes announced that the commission would deliberate and decide within 60 days. As people filed out, an elderly white man approached Teresa. "Miss Morrison, I'm David Whitmore. James Whitmore was my grandfather." Teresa's expression tightened. "I believe you," David said softly. "I believe everything presented today. I found my grandfather's papers after he died. I didn't understand what they meant until your testimony." He handed her an envelope. Correspondence between my grandfather and the committee. Letters discussing Removing the Negro element. Plans for acquiring land evidence. Teresa took the envelope, trembling. Why give this to me? Because it's truth. My grandfather was wrong. What he did was evil. I can't change the past, but I can stop protecting his legacy. Inside were letters from 1913 and 1914, explicitly discussing plans to force black landowners from their property. Proof of premeditation, Aisha whispered. They planned it months ahead. A perpetrator's descendant just handed us evidence, Teresa said, stunned. Maybe conscience survives generations. The commission issued its decision on March 15, exactly 2 years after Michael discovered Elizabeth's photograph. The vote was unanimous. Freeman's Rest would be officially recognized as a historical site. The state acknowledged the community existed, was prosperous, and was destroyed through organized racial violence for the purpose of seizing property. It was the first time South Carolina officially recognized a post-Reconstruction land theft expulsion. The decision included provisions. A historical marker listing all 32 families would be erected. The state would fund comprehensive documentation, and the commission recommended that the legislature consider reparations. National headlines followed. South Carolina acknowledges 1914 land theft opening door to reparations. Elizabeth's photograph accompanied every article. Teresa called Michael that morning with shaking excitement. We did it. Elizabeth's testimony, held in that photograph for 109 years, was finally heard. But recognition was only step one. The coalition immediately prepared legal action, seeking compensation. The case was complex. Land had been sold and resold many times over the decades, and the current owners were not directly responsible for the 1914 theft. Still, the coalition argued that the land had been acquired illegally, the original crime had never been remedied, and descendants had legal standing to seek compensation. The legal battle would take years. But now they had something powerful on their side. Official state recognition that a crime had occurred. In May, a ceremony was held to unveil the historical marker at the site of Freeman's Rest, a large bronze plaque set in stone. It read, Freeman's Rest, 1,891,914. On this land stood Freeman's Rest, a prosperous African-American farming community of 32 families owning over 2,000 acres. In September 1914, the community was destroyed through organized racial violence, and residents were forcibly expelled. Their land was illegally seized and sold to white landowners. At least 3 residents were killed: Joshua Carter, Sarah Pleasant, and Thomas Freeman. This marker honors all who built Freeman's Rest and all who suffered its loss. May their courage and achievement never be forgotten. Below the inscription were the names of all 32 families, including Freeman, Elizabeth 1,878, 1,951, landowner, 125 acres. Nearly 200 people attended, descendants, historians, state officials, members of the press. Teresa gave the keynote speech in the very field where her great-great-grandmother had once owned land. Elizabeth Freeman bought this land in 1913, Teresa said. She paid with years of hard work. She built a home, raised children, and was part of a community that proved Black Americans could thrive, prosper, build wealth, and claim independence. She paused. Then men with guns took it all. Not because Elizabeth did wrong, not because the community failed, but because Black success threatened white supremacy. Because when Black people owned land, built businesses, educated children, and lived free, it challenged the lie of inferiority. She held up the photograph. Elizabeth documented her ownership. She sat for a photograph holding her deed, ensuring evidence existed. She knew truth matters, that records matter, that someday, someone might look closely enough to see. Teresa lifted the image higher. And 109 years later, someone did. Because Elizabeth created evidence, refused to let her story be erased, we are standing here today, saying her name, acknowledging what was built and stolen, and beginning justice. To Elizabeth Freeman, and all the families of Freeman's Rest, we see you. We remember you. We honor what you built, We continue the fight you started. The legal battle for reparations took 3 years to move through the courts. The descendants were not seeking the return of the land legally impossible, after more than a century of transfers. They instead sought monetary compensation equal to the stolen property's value, adjusted for more than 100 years of lost generational wealth. The calculations were staggering. Economists estimated that the 2,247 stolen acres, had they remained in black ownership and been modestly developed, would be worth approximately $45 million today, when lost agricultural income, lost business opportunities, and compounding generational wealth were factored in. The total surpassed $200 million. The defendants, the state of South Carolina and current Clover Township landowners, argued they could not be held responsible for century-old crimes. Too much time had passed. Legal precedents were lacking, but the coalition now had decisive evidence. Official state acknowledgement that a crime had occurred, along with documents proving theft and identifying perpetrators. In March 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling. The court found that while current landowners were not criminally liable, the state held responsibility for failing to protect black citizens in 1914 and allowing the theft to occur without investigation or prosecution. The court ordered the establishment of a reparations fund for the descendants of Freeman's rest. The fund was set at $30 million, far less than the full estimated value, but unprecedented nonetheless. It was the first successful reparations case for post-Reconstruction land theft in the American South. The money was distributed among verified descendants, with additional funding allocated for educational programs, historical preservation, and the creation of a permanent Freeman's Rest Museum. When the decision was announced, Teresa stood on the steps of the state capitol, surrounded by descendants, many elderly, some crying. "This doesn't make us whole," she told reporters. "Money can't replace what was stolen, not just land, but safety, community, opportunity, and generational security. But this acknowledgement matters. This compensation matters. It affirms that black property rights are real, that theft is theft regardless of the victim's race, and that justice, even delayed by a century, is still justice." She raised Elizabeth's photograph. "My great-great-grandmother created evidence of what she owned and what was taken. That evidence changed history. It proved that documentation matters. Bearing witness matters. Truth survives, even when buried for generations." Michael and Aisha watched from the crowd. "We did good work," Aisha whispered. "Elizabeth did the good work," Michael corrected softly. "We just finally looked closely enough to see it." The Freeman's Rest Museum opened in July 2025, on 5 acres donated by David Whitmore. Inside, the complete story was told. The establishment of the community, the prosperity it achieved, the organized violence that destroyed it, a century of silence, eventual acknowledgement, and reparations. The centerpiece was Elizabeth's photograph, enlarged to 10 feet high, with interactive displays allowing visitors to zoom in on every detail. Her face, her clothing, the studio backdrop, and most importantly, the deed she held in her lap. The exhibit text read, "This photograph, taken in March 1913, is more than a portrait. It is a document. It is evidence. It is testimony." Elizabeth Freeman sat for this image, knowing land ownership was both achievement and target. She wanted proof for herself, for her descendants, for historians, for a nation that would one day need to confront what it allowed and what it owed. In creating this image, Elizabeth performed an act of resistance and hope. It concluded with her silent declaration, "I exist. I own this land. I built something. And no matter what happens, there will be proof." More than a century later, her proof changed history. At the museum's opening ceremony, Teresa, now 70, spoke again. She stood at the podium with a towering portrait of Elizabeth behind her. "When I was young," she said, "my grandmother Ruth told me stories about Freeman's Rest, about land, about loss, about Elizabeth, who never stopped believing in truth, even when the world refused to listen. I grew up knowing I came from landowners, builders, people who achieved something extraordinary. But for most of my life, I couldn't prove it. All I had were family stories. And in America, Black family stories are too often dismissed as exaggeration or myth. She pointed to the photograph. Then this image was found, and everything changed. Because Elizabeth, in her wisdom, created proof. She documented truth, and that documentation survived. This museum exists because Elizabeth Freeman sat for a photograph in 1913. The reparations exist because she created evidence. The historical recognition exists because she refused to let her story be erased. This museum isn't just about the past. It's about the power of documentation, the importance of evidence, and the necessity of believing people, especially people whose voices have been systematically silenced, when they tell us what happened to them. She looked out at the audience. Elizabeth Freeman's testimony lived inside this photograph for more than a century, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. How many other testimonies are still waiting? How many truths lie hidden in archives, attics, family collections waiting for someone to finally listen? This museum is a promise. We will look, we will listen, we will believe, and we will seek justice, no matter how long it takes. The museum thrived in its first months. Thousands visited, learning the story. Descendants of other displaced communities came forward with their own accounts of unexplained land loss. The photograph had opened a door sealed for over a century. Children on school field trips stood before Elizabeth's memorial, learning about injustice and resilience. Teachers explained how one photograph could become proof, how documentation could change history, how truth could survive even when deliberately buried. The story is being taught in schools across South Carolina. The case is becoming precedent for other reparations claims. Elizabeth Freeman's name is becoming synonymous with resistance, documentation, and the long arc toward justice. And at the center of everything is that photograph, Elizabeth, in her elegant dress, holding her deed with pride and determination, bearing witness to a truth that has finally, after more than a century, been seen, believed, and honored. Her patient testimony has been rewarded. Her evidence has changed history. Her refusal to let her story be erased has created a legacy that will endure for generations. The woman who sat for a portrait in 1913, knowing her achievement was both remarkable and precarious, ensured that her truth would survive, that someday someone would look at what was in her lap and understand its significance. That justice, though delayed, would eventually arrive. Elizabeth Freeman documented her existence, her ownership, her dignity, and that documentation has transformed history. Her witness mattered, her evidence mattered, her story mattered, and now, finally, the world knows it. On a warm afternoon in November 2025, Teresa Morrison stood in the Freeman's Rest Cemetery. She'd come to oversee the dedication of a special monument, a memorial stone for Elizabeth Freeman. Elizabeth's body had been buried in Charleston, but her spirit, the family agreed, belonged here. The stone was elegant, carved with Elizabeth's name, dates, and an inscription the family chose. Elizabeth Freeman, 1878-1951, landowner, mother, witness. She documented the truth and waited for justice. Her patience was rewarded. Below was a reproduction of the photograph, Elizabeth in her dress, holding her deed, looking forward with pride and determination. Teresa, now 70, ran her hand over the carved image. This would likely be her last major act in the Freeman's Rest project. The coalition had new leadership. The museum was thriving. Reparations had changed lives. The story was being taught in schools. But Teresa had one more thing to do. She pulled out a leather folder containing a copy of Elizabeth's original deed, the document buried with Elizabeth in 1951. The family had decided to move it. The deed would now be permanently displayed in the museum, preserved in a climate-controlled case, visible to everyone learning the story. But first, Teresa wanted to bring it here to this land one final time. She held the deed up to the sunlight, reading, 125 acres in Clover Township. Granted to Elizabeth Freeman. Fee simple ownership. Fee simple, the highest ownership form recognized by law. Complete, absolute ownership. That's what Elizabeth had possessed. That's what had been stolen. Teresa looked around at the field, the museum in the distance, the historical marker, the cemetery. Elizabeth's physical land was gone, transferred through a century of sales to people with no knowledge of the theft that started the ownership chain. But something had been reclaimed anyway, not the physical land, but the truth, the acknowledgement, the story, the memory. We couldn't get your acres back, Teresa said quietly to Elizabeth's memory, but we got your name back, your story back, your dignity back. We made sure the world knows what you built and what was taken. We made sure your testimony was finally heard. She looked at the photograph on the memorial. You were so smart to document it, to create evidence, to believe that someday, truth would matter. A group of school children on a field trip approached, led by a teacher. They were middle schoolers, a mixed group listening with particular intensity. So, she lost everything? One girl asked. Just because she was black? Yes, the teacher said simply. Her race made her vulnerable. Her success made her a target. When men with power wanted her land, they took it, knowing no one would stop them. But she's famous now, a boy observed. This whole museum is because of her photograph. That's right, the teacher said. Sometimes justice takes a very long time. But documentation matters. Evidence matters. This photograph became proof, more than a century later, of what happened here. One student snapped photos with her phone. Can I post this? My grandmother is from South Carolina. She doesn't know about this place. Yes, the teacher said. That's exactly what you should do. Share the story. Make sure people know. Teresa watched the children photograph the memorial, read plaques, discuss what they'd learned. This was what the museum was for. This was what all the work had been for ensuring the story survived. New generations knew what had been built and stolen. Elizabeth's testimony continued being heard. As the group moved toward the museum, Teresa took one last look at the memorial, at the photograph carved in stone, at Elizabeth's face, looking forward with eternal confidence. Your deed goes into the museum tomorrow, Teresa told the image. Thousands will see it yearly. They'll know you owned land. They'll know what you built. They'll know what was taken. And they'll know you never stopped believing truth mattered. She touched the stone gently. Thank you, grandmother. Thank you for sitting for that photograph. Thank you for holding that deed where the camera could see it. Thank you for creating evidence. Thank you for believing that someday someone would look closely enough to finally see. Teresa walked slowly toward the museum where the deed would be installed the next day. Behind her, sunset lit the memorial stone until Elizabeth's carved photograph seemed almost alive, still holding her deed, still testifying, still bearing witness to truth that could be buried, but never erased. The photograph that looked joyful until you noticed what was in her lap, the document that proved everything, the evidence that survived a century of silence, the testimony that finally, after 112 years, has been heard, believed, and honored. Elizabeth Freeman's truth has prevailed.